Hello and welcome to Math Dive in 5, focused today on multiplying fractions, specifically whole number groups of fractions. I am Emily DeVizio and my buddy today is
Joe Rataski. What we'd like you to do right now is to pause the video, and either if you're by yourself or with some other teachers, go ahead and download this task. And what this task is a bunch of multiply and fraction problems. We want you to look at those, maybe cut them apart, sort them, and just think about what would the order be that students would experience these problems. So go ahead and pause, and we'll see you back here in a couple minutes.
back. We hope that you had great conversations around the task that you just previously did. Throughout the PowerPoint today, we probably will be referencing that task, so keep it close at hand. A little bit about the progression of fractions of multiplication. You can see here that in fourth grade specifically, we focus on whole number groups of fractions, unit fractions of whole numbers, models, then algorithms. Joe, I noticed today though, when I did that task, that I was doing fractions by fractions and I was doing whole number groups of fractions, but I also was doing fractions of whole numbers. Why can't I just teach them all together?
Yep, that task did have a mix. It basically had all of the types of problems that students would encounter thinking of multiplying with fractions. But it does not mean that all those tasks were from fourth grade. So if you look at the progression, and this is through the maths standards, in fourth grade, we're only worried about working with whole number groups of fractions. In fifth grade, they would then look at fractions of whole numbers. So you're thinking 4 groups of 1/3. Well, isn't that just the same as finding 1/3 times 4?
That's what I was
1/3
thinking.
of 4? Your product is going to be the same, but your models, the context is going to be very different.
Oh, so similar to whole numbers when we're introducing the concept of multiplication and division. That makes sense.
Yes. A little more complicated because we're working fractions. Now we'll look at this slide that with our new BEST Florida standards, moving down into fourth grade is going to be both of those work with fractions. So you could have a whole number group of fractions and finding a fraction of a whole number. And you notice that we highlighted the commutative property. Students learn that in third grade, that I can flip those two factors around and still get the same product. We eventually want them to be able to do that, but we want to make sure we're using models so that they're understanding that.
I think you said something really important there, the models to understand it, because especially when they're going to be taught within the same grade level, it's going to be really important that they have an understanding of what that looks like.
I try and say important things when I can. But if you're a fourth grade teacher looking at this now and you want your students to have that head start so that they're prepared for next year's fifth grade, you can check out any of the fifth grade unit on finding fractions of whole numbers and maybe give them a little bit of a head start.
There's those great PowerPoints at the beginning that are linked in the unit that kind of give some of that PD for you before you teach it.
That's right.
Just revisiting these two slides that are coming up real quickly because we already talked a little bit about the continuity of structure in the previous drop-in PD section. The most important thing to take from these two slides is to present fractions to students in context so that they can easily understand and determine what is happening in that problem, as well as using the models and visuals to support their understanding.
And you see the roast beef is just an example from the standard itself. And this is just a reminder too, we're looking at the situations involving multiplication. We saw this with whole numbers. We're still going to use it with fractions, with decimals. It means it's just a way to understand the operation. This concept of multiplying fractions, we're going back to what students learned about multiplication itself. Probably back in third grade, they were introduced to multiplication as repeated addition. We can use that same kind of strategy here. Now we're just talking about fractions. So with 4/6, we can have that repeated addition of that unit fraction, 1/6 plus 1/6 plus 1/6, as you see. But now we can represent that as 4 groups of 1/6. Or same thing with 6/3, 6 groups of 1/3. Ultimately, we want the kids to recognize 4/6 is made up of 4 groups of 1/6. Then we'll continue that work in context. You're going to see the same contextual problem. We have boxes, we have amounts of sugar in each box. The only thing changing, we still have 4 boxes, but we see we could have 2 pounds of sugar. That's 4 groups of 2 would give us 8 pounds.
Wait a minute. I'm confused. We've been working with fraction strips and now I see pattern blocks.
Well, yeah, we can have fraction strips, we can have pattern blocks, you can have fraction circles, you can have drawings. It's important sometimes to have those unmarked fraction pieces like pattern blocks so that students have to reason about what fractional amount each of those blocks would represent.
Oh, that makes sense because there's 6 triangles and 1 hexagon, right?
If you wanted the hexagon to be a whole, yep, those would be 6.
Okay.
But you could change it up too. The important thing is that students are working with that same contextual problem. We're just changing one of those factors to be a fraction now. And we're moving that on. You saw that probably those last problems were all unit fractions, but we want to mix in now. Here we're working with 4/6. We're working with 2/3.
Joe, this is great and all, but why can't I just teach my students that 2 times 4 is 8 and then the denominator is 6?
Well, you think that would be easy to just get it done, right? You could get this done in a day. And honestly, we do want the kids eventually to notice that, to discover that pattern between the factors and the product. But we want, through models and visuals, for the kids to discover that. Then they'll own it. It's locked in their brain. They're going to be set with it.
Makes sense. Also connect those fraction strips that we've been working with to the number lines. There you can see that we have the fraction strips represented on the number line, which support students with their then drawings that actually show the physical jumps or distance between the values on the number line. A big misconception of students is they often count the tick marks versus counting the space in between. So those fraction strips, then transferring it to the drawing, support students with their understanding.
And then they can draw on a number line. They won't need their fraction strips.
Can't take those to middle school, can we?
Nope. Ultimately, within this unit, we also want students to work with fractions greater than 1. That's going to happen, as we see here, as some of our products. And we want them to connect back that equivalency they worked on of finding a mixed number that is equivalent to a fraction greater than 1, determining how many wholes. A lot of this probably came up when they were adding and subtracting, and they needed to regroup some of their fractions as well. And this can be done through drawings, with number lines, with fraction strips, or any of our manipulatives.
So I see our end goal is to get them to using the number lines and not necessarily the manipulatives, but doing it with understanding.
Or drawings, any models that they can use, yes.
Just as we discussed in our previous session, we want to make sure that we introduce concepts through the concrete thinking. This way our students build understanding and then ultimately move to representational. But it's not a race to get to the abstract. We can move in between each of these 3 different ways to teach our students the concept of fractions.
Making those connections.
Obviously, absolutely. Thank you for joining us today, and have fun teaching multiplication with fractions. See you next time.